Initially when Linux CDR was developed, Audit D was the first choice, just because it seemed like it fit the use case very well, given that like that was its initial, purpose, right? Of Audit D was supposed to just be able to, somewhat mimic event tracing for Windows, or at least a similar type of tool, but for the Linux platform. But we realized, as we were talking to different customers, that there were a few snags we ran into with that kind of pushed us towards eBPF. The biggest one being some customers were using other products that were using Audit D, and Audit D has a limitation where you can really only have one thing that owns Audit D at a time. So we quickly tried to pivot to eBPF for that reason, but then we also realized that eBPF opened the door for a lot of other types of telemetry. So with Audit, it has certain hook points that it can give you information about, and you can subscribe to those, you can get that data, you can configure it however you want. But if there's something else that you need, Audit isn't necessarily the most flexible tool in that sense, right? To be able to get other pieces of data that it doesn't natively support. It also can bog down the system in terms of performance. And so eBPF, from our comparisons and tests that we've run, has been much more performant than running Audit. And knowing that, again, we're running in a production environment, that was a really important thing to us, is making sure that, we keep it very performant, very fast, very lightweight. And eBPF definitely fit that use case.
Well, first of all, I really appreciate the Linux coverage that ATT&CK already has. I think, especially with one of the more recent updates, I think it was V11 or something, that coverage expanded quite a bit, and it's really, really nice to see that attention happening. I think one of the things that I've noticed with it is certain techniques, like overarching techniques, let's say like inter-process communication. Maybe they'll have like a Windows equivalent or like a Windows implementation of it, like DCOM services, something like that. But there's no equivalent to it added in Linux. And I mean, you can get away with it with like if I'm an attacker using like dbus to issue commands to my implant or something. I'm using inter-process communication, but there's no specific sub-technique of it. So it still has attack coverage. It's just not quite to the same specificity level that Windows is. I've noticed that in a few cases. I know, like I said, though, it's improved quite a bit, especially in regards to like persistence techniques. I really love the expansion of the persistence techniques, like the XDG auto start entries, and like some more examples of like system D services being used. Overall, honestly, I really love ATT&CK as a thing, and I'm really looking forward to both the Linux and container techniques in particular getting more attention here in the future.
That's a good question. And I'd say the way it gets used is it varies pretty widely. Obviously, if you have a well-configured Linux system, then things naturally should just be pretty well locked down and segregated. And so it makes it pretty tricky to do anything until you get some kind of privilege escalation, right? Like it makes it hard to install things, it makes it hard to change things on the system, or be able to potentially get certain pieces of information they might want to retrieve, right? So in terms of how they use privilege escalation, I would say it tends to be one of the first steps. So Thomas had talked about, like, we try to paint the picture of what happened from the beginning of attack, to where the detection occurred, and we want to sort of see that whole timeline. Privilege escalation, I would say, usually is near the beginning of that, either via like an exploit. So, recently there was the PwnKit vulnerability that came out, I think a couple months ago. There was Dirty Pipe as well, right? That was another form of privilege escalation. Both working very differently in terms of how they were able to get elevated privileges. But once that happened, it kind of opens the door to the attacker to then be able to pivot, to be able to install persistence, to be able to install malicious software or whatever it is that their objective is. It usually starts with a privilege escalation.
We have fortunately not really seen that. We are aware of more public reports of that kind of activity happening, catching binaries that could potentially deploy ransomware in VirusTotal, stuff like that. But we actually haven't really seen that happen. I think part of that too is a lot of the times that like Linux-focused adversaries have used ransomware or attempted to use ransomware, they've used it on some pretty specialized virtualization equipment, mostly like ESXi servers. Really specialized systems like that are really sensitive to installing like a third-party agent or something like that, or even really just getting access to the underlying host sometimes can be a challenge, even for system owners. Some vendors will be very careful in what they allow you to install on their hosts, and that definitely makes those particular forms of Linux ransomware very difficult to see firsthand. At least very difficult to see before the ransomware is deployed, I should say.